Keir Giles, Moscow Rules. I am incredibly happy to welcome Keir here. Keir's a fellow at Chatham House. He's also the director of the Conflict Studies Research Center, which has been focusing on Russia for quite a while. And you yourself have been focusing on Russia since the 90s, for quite a while. I'm particularly happy since Keir. I met him first 2012 at King's College London when he was speaking, and it was a very, very good speech. And since then, I think I've probably read everything you've written. I have 14 different works cited in my thesis, which are yours. I'm just going to mention two. You've written the Handbook of Russian Information Warfare for NATO Defense College, which is a very comprehensive account of Russian information warfare. You also wrote Russia's New Tools for Confronting the West, or Russia's New Tools for Confronting the West at Chatham House, which is a good one. Today we're selling Keir's book, Moscow Rules, outside here. So after the event, you can also buy it. I'm happy to say it's cost 70 crowns less than if you buy it at Bokus. So be sure to buy it here. We're also selling our own anthology, Security Policy for New Government, for 50 crowns, what it costs to publish it and distribute it. So I'm going to give the floor to Keir. He's going to speak for 15 minutes about the book. Then him and I are going to have a Q&A, about 20 minutes. And then we're going to open up the floor for 20 minutes and give our very distinguished audience the opportunity to ask you questions. So without further ado.
Thank you very much, Oscar. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And it's a particular pleasure to be here. What Oscar didn't mention is that since we have, over the period since we met, basically been following the same trends in development of Russia's way of warfare, I also cite him an awful lot and try to read everything he writes. So it's particularly pleasant that as soon as Oscar saw the book pop up, he pounced on me. And in fact, this event is happening before the official launch of the book because he was so quick off the mark. So thank you, everybody involved. Why was the book written? Mostly because over the course of several decades of studying and watching and trying to explain Russia, I've noticed that the pattern of how the West tries to engage with Russia is the pattern of trying the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Now, there's a well-known definition for that, which I resisted the temptation of including in the book. But what I am trying to suggest is a plan B for dealing with Russia. Because what we've seen time and again since the end of the Cold War is a repetitive cycle where high hopes for the relationship start to stagnate as soon as it becomes clear that Russia and the West have completely incompatible strategic priorities. Then there's a period where the relationship drifts and becomes more and more frustrating for both sides. Finally, there's a crisis when it comes to a head and the two sides cannot agree over something, and usually some small country around Russia's periphery gets invaded as a result. Then, after a decent period, or sometimes an indecent period, there's a reset. We go back to business as usual, we start off with high hopes again for the new relationship, and the whole cycle repeats again. Now, in late 2011, I wrote a paper about this cycle. It was called The State of the NATO-Russia Reset. And the interviewees that I had from Europe and from the United States were talking in lyrical allegories about the way this repetition is completely predictable. They were talking about the phases of the moon and the rhythmic procession of the seasons and the coming and going of the tides. And there was an American there I interviewed. He had his own cultural reference point. He said it's like the movie Groundhog Day. The point is, at that point, late 2011, I said, we are at this point in the cycle where the next thing that happens is, in a couple of years, to be a major crisis in the relationship. And sure enough, right on time, Russia attacks Ukraine and seizes Crimea just a couple of years later. Which backs up one of the arguments we've been trying to make for some considerable time, that in some ways, the way Russia responds to external stimuli is not unpredictable, and you can say what is going to happen. The problem that we see at the moment is that we are in the danger of repeating the cycle because we are currently at the point where countries are looking for a new relationship with Russia, and once again we hear the language of cooperation, of business as usual, as let us find a way where we can see mutual interests with Russia and not, in fact, establish the red lines and boundaries for Russian behavior, which is so essential. So we're in the danger of this cycle now approaching the reset phase and then starting all over again. The problem is, each time we go through this cycle, the crisis and the confrontation phase is worse and more dangerous. So that's how the book came to be written. But during the research for it, what I found is that so many of the patterns we see in the post-Cold War era are actually so consistent with Russian state behaviors and Russian leadership behaviors, not over decades, but over centuries. We see a lot of writing at the moment for explanations for why Russia behaves in a particular way based on its Soviet past. I argue in the book, actually, the roots go far, far deeper. We are asked, for example, do we have a Putin problem or a Russia problem? And the answer we always give is no, this is a Russia problem because President Putin is enacting Russian security concerns and the consistent ways that Russia seeks to deal with them instead of inventing them. And again, this goes back not just through Soviet times, but actually back into Tsarist history. So we're also asked occasionally, what is it that Russia wants? And the answer, of course, is immense and complicated. There are never any simple answers dealing with Russia because not only are there multiple different state objectives they might have, but also the aphorism from Russia Watchers is everything you say about Russia is both true and untrue at the same time. But if we're to put it in a nutshell, what we see is Russia wanting it to be 1914 again. For there to be great power relationships with smaller states around their periphery, for Russia to be entitled to dominion over its neighbors, to be entitled to, in effect, an empire by another word. We see that Russia has not moved on in the same way as other European states down towards the road of post-nationalism. Instead, the 1914 great power attitudes were frozen and preserved throughout the period of the Soviet Union to emerge and be confronted with an entirely unsuspecting West at the end of the Cold War. And other things about Russia have not moved on since 1914. For example, the measurement of state power based entirely on brute military force, as opposed to any other metrics by which other countries might measure respect. Now that, of course, leads to an inevitable conflict with the rest of the world. Russia's idea that it needs to push threats further away, be they real or imaginary, by extending the territory over which it has control, not necessarily through military invasion and domination, but certainly through other levers of state power, comes into direct conflict with the Western idea that small nations close to Russia should be sovereign, should be independent, should be allowed to determine their own foreign and security policy. So there is a fundamental conflict right at the roots of the relationship. And this is one that we try to explain in the book and ways of dealing with it. Because it is pointless attempting détente, rapprochement, looking for ways of cooperation if the fundamental structure of the relationship is so contradictory and there are differences between the two sides that are covered over, not avowed, not admitted, but instead looking for ways around them. So the key suggestion at the end of the book is how to find a different way of dealing with Russia so that we break out of this cycle, which will inevitably lead to another crisis at the expense of some small country near Russia. Now, we see that Russia is described as operating in an entirely defensive manner. We see that it has done a very good job of persuading people, again, that its aggressive moves to expand its territory are in fact only defensive moves against perceived threats encroaching on it. I think whether that is true or not doesn't matter. It's now become entirely academic what the roots of that argument were because Russia is acting on that basis and it has very effectively convinced its population through years and years of the rhetoric of war that this is in fact the case. It's also irrelevant because whether Russia is lashing out militarily because of its own expansion, its instincts, or because it wants to protect itself against some imaginary threat, that lashing out has the same effect for anybody that's in the path of the blows. Russia has not moved as far down the path of a post-imperial mindset as other countries had this long after the collapse of empire. So if you think of the UK, if you think of the UK and France after, say, 25, 30 years after the end of the Second World War, when they effectively lost their overseas dominions, they were still going through the shock of post-Algeria, post-Suez. Russia has not had an Algeria or a Suez to define the limits of its imperial ambition and define the limits of its power as an effectively small economy on the periphery of Europe. There is a very long way that we have to go before Russia has the same relaxed attitude to its former imperial status as countries like, just to take one example, Sweden. So, what do we suggest? We think that the primary step in moving the relationship onto a more secure, more stable, less unpredictable footing is to actually admit that the two sides' priorities and geopolitical interests are incompatible. And for a model of how to do that, we look to the late Cold War. Now, we're not saying for a moment that we are in the Cold War, although there are similarities that we see, for example, in terms of the ideological conflict, the growing isolation of Russia and its population from the outside world. There are so many factors that mean this is not Cold War 2.0. However, there are plenty of factors in common as well. For example, the ability to keep the relationship, albeit tense, but nonetheless stable at the end of the Cold War. The problem is, in order to get to that state, we have to go through a long, messy and expensive process of setting boundaries, of establishing just what Russia can get away with and what it cannot. And that means, if we take the Cold War analogy, that we're going to go through a period of history which may be quite fraught. We have ahead of us the Berlin crises, 1948 and 1961. We have ahead of us the Korean and Vietnam wars and a whole host of other smaller but deeply nasty proxy wars in Africa and Asia. Particularly, we have crises where matters come to a head, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, like others that were less spectacular but still important. My suggestion is that in order to make those in order to limit the damage of those as much as possible, both to Russia and to the outside world, the first step is to actually recognize that there is a fundamental conflict of attitude and of priorities between Russia and the West, and build the relationship on recognizing those differences instead of pretending that there can be any form of strategic partnership with Russia, the language that we heard so often before 2014. Now, I'm going to pass over to Oscar now for all of the questions that he wanted to ask, actually having read the book.
Yes. Well, I just want to stay on the last point, and I think the acceptance you're talking about, I think, is very important, and that's also, you can see that in U.S. military strategy, saying that long-term strategic competition is now the #1 priority. So it's actually an admittance to what you're saying, but aren't we looking at a paradox here? On the one hand, we'll have a less conflict-prone relationship if we deal with the Russia that's there. On the other hand, you've also very pointedly described the insatiable drive for security and the besieged fortress mentality. Wouldn't admitting and acting as if there's a conflict still further that conflict?
Well, dealing with Russia necessarily involves being comfortable with paradoxes.
Yeah.
Not just this, but in so many other ways that when you deal with the country. But let's compare that approach with how Russia itself sees the current situation. Russia is frustrated that other countries don't recognize that we are already in a state of conflict. They see themselves as already being in intense confrontation with the West in every domain except open military clashes. Whether it's economic or cyber or espionage or assassinating its own and other citizens on the streets of European countries, in every possible way, Russia is already behaving as though it were at war. But the one thing they do not want to risk is an open military conflict, because if that starts with the whole of, for example, NATO, then the outcome is a foregone conclusion.
Yeah.
So, in a way, recognizing that Russia does feel itself to be in conflict would be a positive step in the relationship with Moscow as well, because finally we would be on the same page with Russia in terms of talking about how to manage the relationship, as opposed to the current situation when we're not even in the same library.
Yeah. I'm fully agreeing on that, and I mean, Sweden is one of few countries that have been singled out for conducting a hybrid warfare against Russia in one of all of these statements. But we're going to get back to that in a little bit. One of the things I like the most about the book is how you describe the need for containment. You're saying, since Russia is lacking any kind of internal restrictions, the external ones, the containment that external actors put on Russia, becomes a lot more important. How do we do that?
Okay. Well, first of all, containment is a very loaded term. Anybody that is old enough to remember the Cold War, and I see there are plenty of us in the room, will know that this is a buzzword and a dog whistle term which gets a lot of excited instant reactions if you mention it, particularly to Russians who think that the same policy is already in place now. But I use it because it is the most practical word for the kind of policy that I'm suggesting, which is looking for ways of limiting the instances in which Russia can cause damage around its periphery. And that necessarily does include a policy of making it plain that any such damage will incur costs and consequences, as opposed to there being a swift return to business as usual afterwards. So yes, once again, it's the process of setting boundaries, setting parameters for the relationship, setting exactly what will be acceptable from Moscow and what will not. And if it comes down to the basic conflict over whether a small nation next to Russia is allowed to determine its own policy or not, this is something where the West as a whole, in solidarity, has to stand firm and make it plain that no, this is not acceptable behavior by Russia, undermining or subverting democracies around its periphery.
Yeah. I think that's also a very good point. You talked a lot about Russia so far, but the book also put a lot of emphasis about us and the way we try to perceive Russia and try to understand Russia. At one point, you're writing that the patterns and actions of Russia's leading populations has been both internally consistent and consistently alien to those of the West. What do we always get wrong?
I think it's a preconception that because Russians mostly look like us, like everybody in this room, and think of themselves and describe themselves from time to time as a European nation, there's been this temptation time and again for policymakers, especially senior politicians in the West, to assume that this is a European country, which will be approaching the world with the same mental framework of history and rationality as, for example, Western European countries. But it's simply not the case. There are so many factors which contribute to Russian decision-making which are not in common with how Europe views the world. I've already alluded to one. Europe sees itself in an era of post-nationalist cooperation. Russia instead has defrosted its ideas of great power competition from a century ago. But that is just one of the many, many different aspects, social, cultural, historical, that make up this entirely different approach to how the world works, which includes not only how the state deals with its citizens, or in the case of Russia, we should say subjects, not citizens, but also how countries interact.
Yeah, and picking on that part, because that's also a fascinating part of what we kind of get Russia wrong, this subject versus citizens. But looping to that, I mean, last week we had our foreign minister making the foreign policy declaration, which, as always, in foreign policy declarations, not that many big news, but there was one, and it was the launching of a democracy offensive to the east. You're talking quite a bit in the book about democracy promotion, and you also, I think in a 2014 paper, you quoted a Swedish foreign ministry official at the International Law Department saying, "We see no contradiction promoting democracy in Russia and having a functioning relationship with the Russian leadership." Would you agree on that?
I think you know the answer to that. Yes. It's a classic instance of the difference in mindsets that I'm talking about. So it might be that Western European countries think of democracy promotion as something which is harmless, which everybody is in favor of. But look at the Russian security literature, look at Russian security preoccupations long before the current crisis started in Crimea, and they see democracy promotion efforts as a hostile act. Because, yes, it is seeking to undermine the pillars that make the Russian political system stable. Now, we have not only the fact that the current leadership will see this as a present and immediate threat, and yes, it is a hostile act to try to persuade the Russian population that the political system should work differently, but also the population themselves will have a very specific attitude to the word democracy, especially those who are old enough to remember the associations between democratization and economic collapse and real suffering for the population in the 1990s. So it feeds into the narrative from Russia that Russia is in fact under threat from the West. Most of the aspects of that narrative are completely misguided, because no country near to Russia actually wants an even less stable and even more disrupted Russia to deal with. However, every little thing that Western countries do that Russia interprets as hostile provides confirmation bias and says, look, yes, they are coming to get us, therefore we need to protect our own security by any means possible, up to and including, if necessary, military intervention. Yeah.
So the jump is not that far by saying if we say that we're launching a democracy offensive,
it's a real offensive.
And the Russians saying, it was the head of I think it was head of SVR who said that, singled out Sweden as one of the countries conducting a hybrid warfare against Russia. You're also writing that the fear of the West is considering and bring about regime change appears deep-rooted in a broad sector among the Russian security elite. So this is not the whims of one or two. I'm going to not pose the question if this is a wise thing to do for a alliance-less country neighboring Russia with with armed forces that are rebuilding. But one of the things I like the most about the book is it's got a good historical perspective. A lot of the trends we're seeing that we're being outraged and surprised by has long historical continuity. But that also asks me the questions, okay, fine, but what has changed then? I mean, in one of the early papers you said what was popularized after Crimea was using the armed forces and information warfare. You say this is simply the two most long-standing things that has defined Russian foreign security policy. But what has changed? What is different now? What is not the same as imperial Soviet, post-Soviet times?
Well, let me first pick up on the point about regime change. There is so much evidence that Russia can call on to back up its theory that Western countries want to bring about regime change in Russia. All of the academics, media, etc., that we think of as independent, and Russia will think of as expressing state aims, when they are optimistic about the end of the Putin era and a new regime coming along, that just supports Russia's theory. And of course, it is an extremely dangerous thing to wish for, because unstable transitions in Russia are always difficult for everybody involved. But also, we have to remember Putin is far from the worst possible leader that Russia could have. We may see a trend towards authoritarianism now and towards economic mismanagement, but compared with the long span of Russian history, actually they're not doing too badly with the current leader. To take just one example, the tradition of mass murder of Russians by their own people, whether under orders from the state or in civil war, seems to have ended at the moment. In order to be murdered by the Russian state today, you have to have done something fairly spectacular. It's not the norm anymore, and this is a huge historical departure. But thinking back to the point we were talking about earlier, about expertise on Russia and growing expertise on Russia, the essential point is to look back not just over the last 30 years, because the last 30 years are the aberration from history. It is instead the long span of centuries before it which establishes the norm for Russia, which Russia is now seeking to reimpose. So we need to look further back into the past for the traditions of how Russia and its leaders deal with challenges, because the consistency is absolute.
Yeah. And speaking of consistency, you're also quoting de Christine saying that the political system of Russia cannot withstand 20 years of free communication with Western Europe in 1850s, I think.
Yeah.
Have you heard that recently as well, with the internet?
Well, de Custine, of course, and his travels in Russia from 1839 is the default go-to reference when you want to say, look, Russia hasn't changed. But what I found in the process of researching this book was he's not the only French aristo that you can quote. Whenever you want to say anything about Russia, you can pull out things that have been said previously throughout history. But he was absolutely spot on about in fact, in de Custine's book, that point is about the only one where he expresses some kind of sympathy for Russia's rulers. He says, no wonder they're isolating the country, because if their subjects come into contact with the outside world, it will be hugely disruptive and damaging. Now, the KGB, of course, at the moment thinks that he is absolutely correct. When I was many years ago writing undergraduate dissertations about essays about Russia, one of the topics we were sent back in the day was does information technology pose a fundamental threat to the existence of the Soviet Union? To which, of course, the answer was yes, even back in the day when information technology meant photocopiers and fax machines, because the uncontrolled spread of information and the uncontrolled entry of information into the country is a fundamental security threat for a country which from time to time has banned the import of possession of foreign books altogether. So yes, Russia has always seen, for example, the internet as a threat rather than opportunity. During the middle of the 1990s, when the State Duma was having hearings on whether or not to adopt the internet at all, The the argument from the FSB and FAPSI was no, absolutely not. This is a national security problem. They lost that argument over the course of the last few years. They have won it again, and so the soft filters that were in place to dissuade Russians from looking at foreign news or to provide them with a facsimile of foreign news that is not quite accurate have become firmer and firmer over recent years. Because Russia does see it as a problem if dangerous ideas and opinions and facts about history that are not in accordance with the state narrative come into the country from outside and are then disseminated among the population.
Yeah. No, definitely, and I think just a recommendation of that. There's a fascinating passage in Andrei Soldatov and Irina Borogan's Red Web on the first photocopies machines coming to in the Soviet Union and what they did with them. I also, what you were saying about the democracy promotion, I think you mentioned something, the normal Churchill quote that there's a key to the Russian riddle inside Enigma, etc., etc. But you also, it's not just national interest; it's also paranoia, hysteria, etc. And I think that's very when we talk about democracy promotion, because when you take coincidental events such as Saakashvili getting paid by IRI or NDI to go on democracy promotion and nonviolent protest methods to Serbia, and then half a year later goes to Georgia and does the same revolution, then it's not accepted as chance and coincidence by the Russian leadership. They see it obviously Western money, uprising, revolution. I also wanted to pick up on, I think kind of one of the main threads of the book really becomes we need to sharpen our minds. We need to understand Russia. I mean, Russia is consistent, it's quite predictable, but we always get it wrong. And one example is Lavrov is rumored to have said after Crimea, he said, you guys are angry now, you're screaming very loudly, but in half a year, you'll forget about this. This time, they actually didn't, mainly because of a coincidence with MI-17. But have we changed in any way, or will this pattern just go on for eternity?
Well, if we think back to the situation where we were both in 2012-2013, if we think back to talks given at King's College London Department of War Studies, the other day I was talking about this book and its conclusions to King's College London, and somebody came up at the end who had been in the room in 2013 when I was talking about the problem, the growing Russian threat. And what he focused on was the contrast between the atmosphere then and now. Then it was very much more an uphill struggle to suggest to anybody that Russia was a problem at all, because there was still this strong official view that was promoted through NATO, through individual countries, that actually we are aiming towards a strategic partnership and let's all be friends. And it was very much the minority who said, no, do you not see the divergence in terms of what Russia wants from what the West wants, and how increasingly frustrated Russia is growing? It seems to me that Russia has won that argument for us through Crimea, through MH17, through actions since then. And there's a steady drip feed of antisocial Russian actions that keep that idea prominent in Western policymakers' minds. So we no longer need to argue from first principles that actually Russia does wish us harm. Of course, the next step after that is what do you actually do about it? And that's where it gets a little bit complicated, because resisting Russia in any domain actually involves spending money and throwing people at the problem, and that's something which Western governments are habitually fairly reluctant to do. Western European governments, let me be precise.
I'm happy you mentioned that. So now you're in Sweden. You have people very involved here in Swedish policy. What do you recommend for Sweden? What should we do? Sweden in particular.
Where do we start? Well,
wherever you want.
Again, first of all, the recognition problem. That there are so many completely spurious pieces of evidence that Russia can pick on to say, yes, Sweden is one of the primary actors in hybrid warfare against Russia. But then, on the basis of that, recognizing the consequences. If you do stand firm with values, and if you do wish to promote democracy, then be ready for the kickback. And that means not necessarily just on a state level, but also individuals. Because people who, in one way or another, are implicated in this hybrid warfare campaign, and let me emphasize, when I say hybrid warfare, I mean in the Russian sense. I mean in the ways that Western countries queue up to take a crack at destabilizing Russia. These are real people. These are individual people who are being singled out for attention by the Russian state and its followers, its hangers-on, its trolls and bots on social media, its activists in foreign countries, and suffer the consequences. If they do not have protection from the country, then this is an extremely severe situation. But it comes down to the same problem that we are facing across the rest of the West as a whole, which is the boundary setting problem that I've mentioned already a couple of times. Establishing what is and is not acceptable behavior, because until the boundaries are set, Russia will continue, as it always has done in the past, to push and to probe and to look for areas of weakness and to look for vacuums to exploit. Whether it is a vacuum of military power, of political will to use it, a vacuum of threat perception, for example, among the country's politicians or its population. All of those are weaknesses which need to be addressed, particularly if you are in the front line when it comes to dealing with how Russia might lash out.
I think that's a very, very good answer. On that note, I will open up the floor to the audience. I think we have a microphone to speak in. So please go ahead with a question and try to be a bit succinct, not too much anecdotal, and we'll go straight up. I see your first question there.
My name is Joachim von Braun. First, a short remark. Putin has called internet for a CIA project, and actually they are now building their own internet. So I mean, we are seeing that at the moment. I was very active during the 80s, fighting Soviet active measures, Aktivnie Meropryatия, as it then was called. Well, I still call it that. And we were smuggling fax machines, copy machines, cameras, tape recorders to Estonia, Latvia, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. So we were very practical in helping them. And just not setting the boundaries. What could we learn from the 80s and do today, practically? I mean, should we smuggle encrypted USB memories to them? Or, you know, what can we do to actually help practically?
Understood. Do you want to take one at a time? Or?
Yeah, we'll take another one. Let's see. You won. Morten?
Sorry. My name is Johan Molander. It will be very short. I think Oscar mentioned that there were only external restraints on Russia's behavior. My question then would be, what about economy, what about demography, and what about technology? Aren't they internal restraints?
Okay, great. Yes, Russia is practicing shutting off its internet connection to the outside world. This has made the news just over the last few days, but it's actually what we're seeing as the culmination of a long-running program. It is, I'm going to dwell on this a little bit because it is significant, in part because it illustrates the trends in how Russia is thinking about security and how it is imposing its thoughts on the population, sometimes damaging the population and hurting its interests with the excuse of this is to deal with the West, in the same way as you punish the West by preventing Russians from buying European cheese. Yes, Putin thinks the internet is a CIA project. That mindset is what explains the reference to Russia being under attack by cutting off the internet. They think that the United States runs the internet and therefore can at will switch Russia off, which, of course, anybody who knows anything about how the internet actually works realizes that this is nonsense. But that's the culmination of a trend in Russia dealing with information technology and information security, which in the early stages saw the actual technical providers of internet services more or less ignoring what the security services were saying. Because the security services were saying, look, free flow of information across borders is a national security threat. We need to stop this. And the internet service providers were saying, well, then you break the internet. That's not going to happen. What that happened that was the case up until about 2012, 2013, when Putin banged heads together and said, no, we're going to do it anyway. And that was the start of preparations for Russia internalizing all of the information and practicing to cut itself off from the outside world in time of conflict. And it is an indication again of how much further advanced Russia's perceptions of threat to itself were than to any other country, because at the time the idea that the internet was a problem was again a very, very hard argument to make when we were suggesting that Russia sees content as well as code as being a security threat. This was not something which was of which we were able to persuade Western policymakers at all. And now, of course, with the rise of trolls, bots, fake news, etc., it's become clear exactly what Russia means by that. Again, they've proved the point for us. But in terms of practical measures, countering активное мероприятие and importing fax machines, yes, you're a prime agent of Swedish hybrid warfare, which it would be possible to do again, but of course we need to bear in mind that there are practical limitations to how far you can reach into Russia's population to talk to them, given that for over a decade Russia has been putting in strenuous efforts to make sure that you can't. So a lot of the things that that were taken for granted in conversations about how to reach the Russian population in the early stages after 2014, when people thought, well, how can we talk back? How can we talk to Russians in the same way they're talking to us? No, Russia had already closed off those avenues through which you might want to reach to prosecute an information campaign to bring a real picture of the outside world and of Russia to Russia itself. So again, just as with the Democracy Promotion Initiative, you need to be bounded not only by whether or not this is an escalation, but also by the practicalities and the practical limitations on what can be achieved. Finally, there will be an argument that if you resort to measures like that, it is escalating the problem, it is doing something undeniably hostile to Russia, and it will therefore make the situation worse. The counter to that argument is Russia thinks you're doing it already. It's not an escalation if they think it's already underway, if Russia thinks that it is already being subverted by Western powers with the United States in the lead. And secondly, what about the self-imposed restrictions? What about the fact that Russia's ambition will eventually be constrained by economic and demographic and technical limitations? All of these are very real and present. All of these are things that Russia has looked for ways to work around. So sanction-proofing the economy, constraining military spending when it becomes clear that actually it is not going to be affordable. The economic crisis did not, in fact, render the defense budget smaller. It didn't make it smaller. Instead, it had got past the most expensive phase of reorganization, rearmament, military transformation, and now we're in a more steady state of defense expenditure, which the economy can support. And of course, technology. Well, it has always been the case that Russia has not reached the same level of technical sophistication, particularly in military terms, as other countries, but it is something which they are very used to working around. The bottom line for all of this is that when Russia looks for solutions in the face of all of these constraints, it may not be elegant and it may not be efficient in the way that other countries may have done it, but it is highly likely to be effective.
Thank you very much for that. More around the question. Start with Staffan.
It's perhaps a little more of a comment. You talked about our perceptions or Western perceptions of Russia and that Putin has sort of fixed this problem and that we now understand where we are. Also with respect to the mindset, you said senior politicians do not understand, in Western Europe, do not understand the Russian mindset. Well, I would argue that there is one senior politician in Europe who does understand the Russian mindset. And for those of you who have not seen it, I would recommend the German Chancellor's address at the Munich Security Conference. She is less restrained than she used to be in the twilight of her chancellorship. And she says in very clear words, with Lavrov present in the hall, with a member of the Chinese Politburo present in the hall, how she views Russia and how she views China at the moment. You might not agree with all the conclusions that she draws, and of course she's struggling with the gap between the realism of her assessment and the constraints on her as a German chancellor with the history that Germany has and so forth. But certainly she does understand the mindset of the Russians.
And speaking of, we touched upon hybrid threats before. What better opportunity than to pass the mic to Swedish current ambassador for hybrid issues?
Countering hybrid threats, I think.
Countering hybrid threats. Oh, thank you.
At the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much. I would like to return to the issue discussed before about imposing costs. And especially because, I mean, Russia now has a sort of a broadened, not only a broadened, widened toolbox, but it also has that the threshold for acting aggressively has been lowered, so to say. And on our side, the vulnerabilities has increased. So how do we deal with deterrence in a hybrid threat environment? How do we impose costs? Because we're often restrained, cannot and will not answer in kind, tit for tat. So this whole question of modern deterrence and how do we impose costs for malign, malicious behavior, how do we deal with that? Because we are usually, it's the foreign and security policy establishment that are used to think about this. The problem or the issue with hybrid threats is that they often manifest themselves as an issue for the internal security establishment, who are not used to think in terms of security and foreign policy. And how can we address this gap? I think UK has come a very long way because of Salisbury Skripal. Many other countries have not closed this gap. And what's the advice on that? Thank you.
Understood. Great. Thank you. Yes, it does seem that Angela Merkel's patience has finally been exhausted. We are a long way now from the situation where a former German chancellor would go off and be paid by a Russian gas pipeline instead of power. So things have moved on, but we're still with the same problem of, yes, the threat is recognized, but then there is the additional step that is needed to actually do anything about it. Which segues neatly into the how do we counter hybrid threats question. If we talk about imposing costs, then we are in the realms of deterrence by punishment. However, deterrence by denial is always going to be cheaper and more effective in the long run. And that means bolstering societal resilience against these problems, making it plain that this is not even just a whole of government approach, because Russia, in fact, is leveraging whole of society vulnerabilities. This means, as you say, that individuals need to have their threat perception boosted. Again, I use analogies from the Cold War, but I stress I'm not saying we are in the Cold War, but at that point, the perception and the notion that we are under external attack was far more prevalent among populations because everybody knew where the threat was and could see it. So when we are asked in particular about steps needed to raise that kind of awareness, we usually say that the first step is often to recognize the problem by means of some senior leader actually stating that we are under attack, and then promoting that knowledge among the people that need to know it. Now, that, of course, requires a certain amount of political courage in some countries, because not everybody is actually going to be able to vocalize the ongoing Russian threat. But it's an essential first step for laying that foundation of whole of society resilience, in order that the easy opportunities for Russia to take action which damages a country or a society are closed off. And therefore, if you make yourself a hard target, the blows are likely to fall elsewhere. Now, perversely, when we're asked about how exactly that could be brought about, we do actually point to the Nordic countries, Sweden and Finland, as examples of, well, start there. Take a look at that, particularly in terms of Finland, because they mirror the comprehensive approach to defense that Russia is creating in its own subordination of all state agencies to the general staff in, for example, the National Defense Direction Center. Whole of government, whole of society, looking for weaknesses. Close off the weaknesses and you make yourself a much less attractive target for Russia to try to degrade your societal cohesion and therefore attack your vulnerabilities.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting because Sweden, when you go abroad, you always get complimented for Sweden's total defense concept, whereas when you're here and you're looking at even a bit more closer, you're one becomes a bit less optimistic. I'm gonna try to frame this as a question, but aren't we very bad at understanding what Russian leaders understand as deterrence? Now Fredrik mentioned the D word. Aren't we just looking down on our feet saying that, oh, this should be deterrence? I mean, do we understand when we're doing deterrence? For instance, putting more battalions in the Baltic states, and now we say, bam, now we're deterring Russia, or now we're tripwiring Russia, etc. How good are we in looking what is deterrence in the Russian leadership's eyes?
Well, the NATO enhanced forward presence battalions in the Baltic states and Poland are a perfect example of another aspect of deterrence. If you look up from your shoes and look at broader issues, which is the absolutely critical nature of multinational unity against Russia, in order not to be a national target that Russia can pick off one by one. And this is where NATO and the EU and consensus building and making it plain on a supranational alliance level that there will be a unified response becomes so absolutely important. Now, the NATO EFP battalions are sometimes criticized for being a tiny gesture which would provide no more than a speed bump to any Russian offensive action, but that rather misses the point, because they are an expression of NATO unity. They are an indication to Russia that it cannot pick off one of those small nations without immediately involving the rest of NATO and making any conversations on Article 5 a foregone conclusion, because several countries have their servicemen involved straight away. And it is measures like that which make the risk calculus negative in Russia's eyes, by making it plain that yes, there'll be a united response to any Russian action across the EU or NATO, or across in general the Western consensus of how states should run. Witness the reaction when in October last year the UK, the US, the Netherlands coordinated their releases of information on, for example, the Skripal assassination, the OPCW hacks, US cyber indictments, and made it plain in the United Nations that this was actually a united front against Russian action. That seems to have taken Russia a little bit by surprise, particularly with the response to the attempted murders of the Skripals in Salisbury. Russia, I am sure, will have been just as surprised that there was international unity in the response as we were.
Yeah. No, and I think that's a key issue. Also touching upon what you said earlier, that the people during the Cold War knew that they were in a state of conflict, and I make a passionate defense in this book for really showing more what's going on, so the people can build a resilience there. You can make a quick one, and I did forget to introduce you. Ambassador Johan Molander was ambassador to Moscow, so you get a second one only for that.
You have talked a lot about the historic trends, and I do agree. But isn't there one major difference between historic trends, as we know Russia from Ivan Vasilievich, Alexei Mikhailovich, whoever, up until today, and that is the nature of Russian kleptocracy and the fact that so much stolen money is stacked away in the West. I think first that is a difference to Tsarist times and Soviet times. Secondly, does that not provide us with weapons of deterrence?
Yes and no, as usual with Russia. So yes, there is a distinct difference in that while we see a continuation of the Russian historical pattern that first, there's little distinction between ruling the country and owning it, and second, the country's riches are farmed out to trusted individuals to manage, but it's not actually their property, it can be taken away at will. The difference now is, yes, the bank balances overseas, and the way Russian elite figures send their children to British boarding schools. Whether or not this constitutes a vulnerability is, of course, completely dependent on how exactly it is treated. Now, Russia certainly perceives this vulnerability, which is why we see these calls for capital that is stashed abroad to be repatriated. Of course, in classic Russian fashion, they shoot themselves in the foot by saying, no, there'll be no consequences for bringing the money back, but then they launch criminal prosecutions against people who actually do. So again, as usual, it is a nice idea, but the implementation is messy. Whether it will actually provide any form of deterrence depends on the relationship between the people whose assets you target and the Kremlin. There's been a cozy idea that the inner circle will actually influence Putin's behavior and Russia's behavior overall by feeling that their assets are under attack. I think it is a far more nuanced situation than that, and there is a great risk of going after the wrong target by targeting with, for example, the UK's unexplained wealth orders, the unexplained wealth that arrives in London. So yes, it does provide a deterrent measure, and it is one that it is worth holding in reserve as Russia grows currently more used to Western sanctions. They hurt, but not as much as they might. It is always worth having one or two further steps that could be taken to keep it current in the minds of Russian decision makers that any further aggressive action might in fact incur further costs.
We have a question here.
Thanks. Mats Åberg. Coming back to your containment discussion and your discussion on circles, big and small ones. What does your crystal ball say about Transnistria, Gagauzia, and Moldova?
And we can take a second question from Robert while we stay here.
Robert Olsha. I'm puzzled by Russia's concept of security. They complain about a battalion in Estonia constituting a threat. They complain about 300 Marines in Norway constituting a threat to their security. And as President Ilves say, come on, be serious, look at the map, you sneeze and we die. But might it be that when the Russians say security, they mean great power status? And if small countries on the border can do such things against Moscow's will, it reflects badly on the great power status.
Okay.
Crystal ball and great
So,
power status.
Everything that's happening in and around Moldova, same principle as anywhere else. A frozen conflict may be defrosted at any time if Russia senses an opportunity to utilize it to further extend its control, not again in terms of necessarily military occupation and rolling tanks across the border, but further extend its political control across territory and reduce or remove perceived threats. So at any time, if the political situation shifts in such a way that there is the perception that breadth of control can be extended, then I have no doubt that they will continue to do so. On why would Russia not complain? Russia doesn't want this to happen. And ever so often, if Russia complains loud enough and shouts and waves its fist, then things do get rolled back. So it's definitely worth trying to frighten everybody concerned into not putting a NATO security presence in the Baltics. And let's not forget, for a while, they were highly successful at that. It took an enormous effort to get a NATO consensus on actually making those forward deployments. And the conversation is still ongoing with what US forces do you put forward in Poland. Russia will always complain. Russia will always make a noise about things that they would rather didn't happen. The art of it is establishing the distinction between where this is just noise and bluster and bravado and trying to intimidate people into not doing something for their own security, and where Russia's own vital interests are actually under threat. Now, it's probably only a fairly brave intelligence analyst in Moscow who cares little for their career who will say, who will report up the chain that actually, no, NATO doesn't pose any threat to us, because that goes so strongly against the prevailing narrative in Russia. However, it's worth watching the nuance and the detail of the language and indications of where Russia does actually say that it will intervene militarily to protect its interests, because I mentioned earlier, Russia isn't so unpredictable as we say. They do, in fact, sometimes say what they're going to do and then do it. In the case of the Baltic states, all of the language is not about a firm response to EFP or even to any expansion of EFP. That is a stable situation. What Russia dislikes and takes action against is an unstable situation that can deteriorate rapidly against Russian interests and against Russia's perception of what makes its national security. As we saw, for example, in Ukraine, as we saw in Syria, both of them demanding a military intervention from Russia, which they then brought about and reinforced with the results their belief that actually military intervention is an extremely effective way of resolving geopolitical challenges with very little in the way of costs and consequences afterwards.
Yeah, and there's little empirics to challenge that view. I mean, that view keeps being the case. No, and I think I like the distinction you made, and that's the fundamental one when it comes to Sweden and a possible NATO membership as well, because there's no cost of making it appear as Russia will be as aggressive as possible, and then if that happens, it will be you don't know, that's the hard part to disintegrate what is just scaring, which you have all incentives to do, and how much is meant it. We have time for, I think, probably 2 short last questions. We have one there, and then the last one there.
Thank you. Göran Lindmarker is my name, chair of the Swedish Atlantic Council. I think though one might make a difference between country and regime. If you look at what happened in Ukraine, the Euromaidan, which was perhaps one of the greatest events in Europe during the last years. I mean, civil society really doing a fantastic job. That was a lethal threat to the regime in Russia. But on the other hand, what happened, and the response was, of course, seen from a more nationalistic Russian viewpoint, was that Russia lost Ukraine. We see now the divide in the Orthodox Church, which is an enormous. And if you go there in Ukraine, those who hate Russia most, or Kremlin most, are those former Russian who had close connections with Russia. We were brothers and sisters, and now you kill us, which is the reaction. So if you divide that, you can say that perhaps that was a big loss for Russia, perhaps necessary for the regime. My second point is what to do. What we've done for many years, though, is supporting the countries like Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova. Sweden, for example, was the biggest bilateral supporter, perhaps still is, for Moldova and Georgia, and certainly one on Ukraine. We've been there for 12, 15 years, supporting these countries, which I think are the most crucial now, to see to it that those who want to have an independence and sovereignty, that we support them. And certainly the West does with tens of billions of dollars. So don't forget that.
Thank you. And we can pass the mic all the way into the front.
Yeah. Hello, thank you. John Branton, Swedish Minister of Foreign Affairs. Coming back to the issue of deterrence and follow up a bit on Frederick's question. I mean, deterrence, of course, means devising costs, coming up with costs that can change calculus, but it also means communication and how to communicate credibly and intelligibly with the Russian leadership, signaling in different ways. You mentioned unity, speaking with one voice, to be a crucial aspect of this. This, of course, is difficult. It gets more and more difficult. Brexit's coming up, and I mean, I agree with you. There's some trends in Europe point to another direction than perhaps we would like to go. So, how can we uphold credibility? How can we communicate better with the Russian leadership in a way that actually understand that we're serious, that we mean what we say? Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Very good. Yes. Difference between the leadership and the country. Well, again, the problem we come back to is the willingness of the leadership to subject its people to deprivations and to a lowering standard of living in pursuit of entirely illusory security claims. But coming back to the point that Robert made, which I failed to address in the response to him, the one thing that does seem to be consistent in terms of a unified approach by both regime and people is the notion of Russia as a great power. We may define it in different ways, but Russia's notion of a great power, a unique country in the world, one that has a voice and a veto in world affairs, and one that is a force to be reckoned with on a par with the United States. So many of the actions that have been taken by Russia are aimed at achieving that goal, and this, it seems, has full support among Russia's population, to the extent that, yes, you do see the trend once again, where people are accepting of a certain amount of degradation of their own standard of living for the sake of living in one of the countries that needs to be reckoned with in world affairs. So in that respect, sometimes there isn't so much gap between the leadership aims and the aims of the population, which, let's not forget, have been told what is important for Russia by state media now for so many years. In terms of support for the countries around the periphery, well, that is a key aspect of containment in the sense that I give it, of limiting the opportunities for Russia to do damage. Building stable and resilient societies wherever possible in order that they are not vulnerable to the kind of exploitation, but also to the kind of schism that we've seen in Ukraine will be a key aspect of limiting where exactly Russia can exert malign influence against its neighbors and consequently indirectly against those countries that support them. Which is also to do with the deterrence issue and how exactly do we communicate and signal to the Russian leadership. I come back to the demonstrations of unity by Western countries, which I think are a significant new departure in dealing with Russia. Making it very clear that you're not working on a bilateral basis between Russia and some other small nation, but actually with a whole alliance which is standing together. I think that message needs to be reinforced. I think the trend of disclosing evidence of Russian malign activities, even if it's only, as in the case of the Skripals, only disclosing enough evidence that the international media, including media in Russia, can then go off and put the pieces together for themselves and arrive independently at the analysis of what Russia has done, is absolutely key. Now, you can't, as people often point out, you can't name and shame a country that doesn't actually feel any shame to do with its actions. However, you can adjust, again, the risk calculus. You can foster deterrence by denial, by making it plain that actually, no, this is not something that will go unnoticed and forgiven, and lead to a return to business as usual with the West as a whole in 6 months, as somebody said, because everybody would rather prefer to ignore it. No, the unity aspect is key, and the publicity and transparency for what Russia is doing, which Western countries seem to be taking the first tentative steps towards, is a key element of that.
So, if that makes you all feel gloomy, I have some encouraging words, and that is that the most consistently reliable predictions of future developments tend to come from the most pessimist and cynical observers. Your own words. Let us thank here with a big round of applause. And
Thank you.
if you're not convinced by now, it's an excellent book. Go and buy it right outside to the left. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.